If someone builds a physical wall right in front of you, like brick and mortar, maybe a line of barbed wire strung across the top, your instinct is instantly to figure out how to get over it
Yeah.
or, around it.
Right, or under it, because you can actually see it. It occupies physical space.
Exactly. You can measure the height, you can calculate the resources you need, and you just make a concrete plan to bypass it.
And from an evolutionary standpoint, human beings are incredibly adept at that, like navigating physical spatial realities. We see a barrier, we solve the equation.
But what happens when the wall is completely invisible? What if it's a structure you don't even know you're locked inside of?
Oh man, that is the absolute trickiest kind of prison.
It really is. It's the kind you walk around in every single day,
Yeah.
completely unaware that your movements, your career decisions, your relationships, all of it are being strictly monitored and confined.
Yeah, strictly confined by your own mind.
Exactly. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are tailoring this exploration specifically for you, the learner, because we know you're looking for those paradigm-shifting insights.
Right, the actual mechanics behind why people operate the way they do, but, without drowning in an ocean of academic jargon.
So our mission today is exactly that. We are going to completely unpack the architecture of that invisible prison and, more importantly, the specific philosophy of fearlessness you need to actually break out of it.
We're drawing the framework for this from a really fascinating convergence of minds. It's a deep dive into the 50th law.
Which is co-authored by 50 Cent Curtis Jackson and the historian Robert Greene.
Yeah, and the foundational premise they lay out is exactly what you just described with that invisible wall. They argue that our human fears function as this, invisible psychological panopticon.
We walk around believing we're making purely rational choices, about our careers, our investments.
But in reality, an enormous percentage of those choices are simply us unconsciously avoiding what makes us anxious. So the core thesis here is that by achieving total, uncompromising fearlessness, we unlock our ultimate power.
Right. We stop reacting to circumstances and we start actively shaping them. And the origin of this philosophy is what makes it so grounded.
It's such an unlikely alliance.
It really is. You have Robert Greene, who spent decades poring over history. He's dissecting the power dynamics of Machiavelli, the military strategies of Napoleon, the maneuverings of the Borgias.
And then you have Curtis Jackson, who learned those exact same power dynamics, but not in a library. He learned them surviving the crack epidemic of Southside Queens in the 1980s.
It's a striking parallel. When they sat down together, Greene essentially recognized that Jackson was a living, breathing embodiment of the historical figures he'd spent his whole life writing about.
Yeah, Greene called him a sort of hip-hop Napoleon Bonaparte.
Which is such a wild comparison, but it works perfectly.
Yeah.
They came from utterly divergent worlds, but their lenses on human nature were identical.
Right, their ability to see past the polite, benign explanations people give for their behavior, to figure out what they are actually up to.
So here's our roadmap for you today. We're going to explore the 10 core principles of this fearlessness. We'll look at how Curtis Jackson evolved from a corner hustler into a massive corporate empire.
And we'll place his specific tactical maneuvers right alongside historical figures, like Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Richard Wright.
But before we can actually conquer fear, we have to look at the mechanics of it. Like, how did fear mutate from a primal survival tool into this ambient daily anxiety that plagues so many of us?
To understand that, you really have to look at the evolutionary mismatch. I mean, back in the Pleistocene epoch, fear was simple. It was highly localized and incredibly healthy.
Right, like a saber-toothed tiger steps out of the brush.
Exactly. Your amygdala spots the threat, it floods your nervous system with adrenaline and cortisol, your heart rate spikes, and you run.
It was a mechanism designed exclusively to keep you alive in the face of imminent physical death.
Yes. And once the tiger was gone, the physiological response was supposed to shut down. The animal goes back to baseline.
It eats, it sleeps. It doesn't spend the next 3 weeks agonizing over whether another tiger might show up next Tuesday.
Exactly. The fear dissipates. But as human civilization rapidly advanced, we engineered our environment to be incredibly safe. I mean, we largely eliminated the tigers.
We built cities, established laws, created antibiotics.
But our neurological hardware didn't evolve at the same speed as our environment. We still possess a nervous system deeply wired for high alert survival.
So because the physical threats vanished, the emotion didn't just decrease, it mutated.
It needed a new target to attach itself to.
Precisely. It mutated into generalized abstract anxiety. Instead of running from predators, we're now terrified of, like, social death.
We agonize over our status like, Will I be fired? Did I sound stupid in that meeting? What do people think of me?
We worry about the economy, the aging process,
Yeah.
and a decisive shift happened in the 19th century when mass media advertising and journalism discovered a highly profitable psychological trigger.
They realize that you literally cannot look away from a threat. It is biologically impossible for a human to ignore danger.
Because ignoring danger used to mean death. So modern media essentially hijacked our amygdala.
They frame every story with fear to capture our attention. It's the newest health scare, the latest economic collapse, the hazards lurking in our food.
And the ultimate irony here is that you and I are living in the safest, most statistically predictable time in human history. Yet we walk around with this defensive, retreat-oriented posture.
We view almost every interaction in terms of risk and vulnerability. Which brings us to the antidote in Chapter 1. Greene and Jackson refer to this as intense realism.
Seeing things exactly for what they are.
Right. If generalized, ambient anxiety is the disease, intense realism is the cure. And to understand the mechanics of this, look at the reality of an 11-year-old Curtis Jackson in Southside, Queens.
Yeah, let's set that scene. He has no father in the picture. His mother is murdered when he is 8.
He's living in a crowded house with his grandparents. He has immense, unbridled ambition. But the data points he is gathering from his environment are just incredibly grim.
He's running a pure cost-benefit analysis at 11 years old.
It's wild to think about an 11-year-old doing that, but he did. He looks at the adults working legitimate jobs, taking the bus to low-wage labor, and sees them struggling just to keep the lights on.
And then he sees the people turning to violent robbery ending up dead or incarcerated.
Right, and he sees the local addicts losing their autonomy entirely. The only people in his immediate physical environment who possess the resources, the autonomy, and the respect that match his ambition are the local corner hustlers.
So he makes a highly pragmatic, unsentimental choice to enter that life. But the moment he does, he realizes the streets are pure chaos.
Oh, absolutely. Erratic customers, police surveillance, rivals looking to exploit literally any weakness.
And this is where he receives a master class in psychology from an older hustler named Truth.
Yeah, Truth tells him something really counterintuitive. He says, don't complain about the chaos. The hard life of the streets is actually an asset, but only if it forces you into a state of hyper-attunement.
Because the danger is so immediate, you just can't afford to live in a fantasy world.
Exactly. You have to read a person's microexpressions. You have to deduce their true intentions. Truth's vital warning was that the greatest danger a hustler faces is never the police, and it isn't the rival crews.
It's your own mind going soft.
Exactly that. The internal environment is way more dangerous than the external one. Think about it. When things are going well, what happens?
You get complacent.
You assume the money will flow forever, so you stop scanning the horizon for disruptions. Conversely, when things go badly, you get depressed. You start wishing the world operated fairly.
And you fall for some desperate scheme to get quick cash.
In both scenarios, your emotions cloud your data processing. You lose your grip on reality. And on the streets, losing your grip on reality is fatal.
So you have to develop what they call the hustler's eye.
Right. It's the capacity to pierce through the hype, the polite social masks, and your own wishful thinking to see the raw geometry of a situation.
And Jackson applied this ruthlessly, like fast forward to when he's 16. A brief lapse in that intense realism lands him in a shock rehabilitation center in upstate New York.
Which is basically a boot camp. Most kids in that situation spend their time fantasizing about getting back to the neighborhood, getting back to the corner.
But he used that confinement to run another brutal assessment of his reality. He looked at the long-term trajectory of his current business model.
He saw that hustling has a hard ceiling. You age out, you go to prison, or you get killed. The risk-to-reward ratio degrades over time.
So right then, he decides to transition entirely into the music business. No backup plan, no safety net.
What is genuinely fascinating here is how the mechanics of this hustler's eye apply perfectly to one of the most revered figures in American history.
Right, Abraham Lincoln.
Hmm?
We rarely group a 19th century president with a Queens street hustler. But the psychological framework is identical.
It really is. Lincoln grew up on the harsh frontier. He was supremely practical. His mind worked like an engineer's. He liked taking machines apart to understand the underlying mechanisms.
And when he assumed the presidency during the absolute crisis of the Civil War, he stepped into a cabinet filled with men driven by rigid political ideologies.
And explosive emotions. His advisors thought he was weak. They mistook his slow, methodical decision-making process for indecision.
Because they were operating on emotion. and he was operating on intense realism. Lincoln came to every crisis without ideological preconceptions.
He judged people and situations purely by their tangible results. That is the only reason he stuck with General Ulysses S. Grant.
Right. The political establishment hated Grant. He is an alcoholic. He was notoriously rough around the edges.
And his tactics were incredibly bloody. The ideological purity of the cabinet demanded Grant be fired. But Lincoln looked at the raw data.
Grant was the only general actually moving troops forward and winning battles.
Exactly. Lincoln famously said, "I cannot spare this man, he fights." His ability to compartmentalize his own emotional preferences and focus exclusively on the firm ground of reality was his ultimate strategic advantage.
So if you are listening to this right now, maybe you're navigating a massive corporate restructuring or dealing with a highly toxic manager. What is the actual application?
Well, the intuitive assumption is that staring directly at the brutal, unvarnished reality of your situation will make you depressed.
Right. That's what we usually think.
But this philosophy argues the exact opposite. Pure realism brings lightness.
Wait, lightness. How does that work?
Because it eliminates the gap between expectation and reality. Depression and anxiety usually live in that gap. If you are constantly wishing your boss was a more empathetic person, you will be constantly disappointed and drained when they aren't. But if you strip away the fantasy, if you accept that this person is driven purely by self-preservation and ego, you aren't surprised by their actions.
You aren't emotionally wounded when they take credit for your work.
Exactly. You are empowered because you're now operating with accurate data. You can anticipate their moves. You start seeing the world like a chessboard rather than a tragedy.
There's a biological analogy here that makes this click for me. We talked earlier about fear mutating. Modern anxiety is like a car alarm that was originally engineered to detect a highly specific threat.
Like someone's smashing the window to steal the stereo.
Exactly. That's a valid threat. But over years of slight malfunctions, the sensor has become hypersensitive. Now, the alarm is blaring at 3 a.m. just because the wind blew a leaf against the windshield.
Yeah, a total false positive.
Intense realism is the discipline of refusing to panic. It's getting out of bed, walking to the window, identifying the leaf as a leaf, and intentionally turning the alarm off.
That is exactly the mechanism. You're overriding the faulty alarm system with pure observation.
But once your eyes are open to the actual physics of your environment, once you see the leaf instead of imagining a burglar, the very next question is, how do you operate in that environment?
Without becoming entirely dependent on someone else. Because seeing reality doesn't automatically protect you from it.
Which moves us into the next core principle in chapters 2 and 3, self-reliance and opportunism. The requirement to make everything your own.
We go back to Jackson after his stint in the shock rehab center. He returns to his neighborhood. His money is gone. His territory has been claimed by others. His customers have moved on.
A friend offers him what looks like a lifeline. A job bagging up crack cocaine for a daily wage. It's safe, steady, reliable cash.
But he sits in that room with the other baggers, and he runs another analysis. He runs an economic analysis on the concept of wage labor.
He realizes he is trading his ultimate freedom for the illusion of security.
Exactly. The other baggers in the room were former dealers who had encountered the chaos of the streets and gotten scared. They traded their autonomy, their upside potential, for the predictable comfort of an employer.
But Jackson knew from his childhood that depending on others is an evolutionary trap.
The moment you rely on someone else for your livelihood, your protection, or your sense of worth, you are fundamentally at their mercy. They own the means of production, which means they own you.
If the boss decides your wages are cut in half tomorrow, you have no leverage.
Right, so he engineers a classic asymmetric maneuver. He tells the other baggers that if they give him the extra leftover product that spills when he teaches them a more efficient way to fill the vials, he will give them his daily cash wage.
He's sacrificing short-term capital for equity.
Yes, within a week, he has accumulated his own stash of product. He bypasses the wage system, gets back on the corner on his own terms, and swears he will never work as an employee for anyone again.
And what is incredible is that he ported this exact street-level economic theory directly into corporate America.
The scale changed, but the mechanics didn't. Years later, when he signs a massive deal with Interscope Records, he observes the exact same dependency trap.
Right. Corporate executives lavished artists with massive advances, luxury cars, private jets.
But in exchange, the corporation owns the master recordings. They control the image, and they dictate the marketing. It is the exact same dynamic as the drug bagging job, just heavily sanitized with better office furniture.
So Jackson treated Interscope not as a boss, but as a bank. and a university.
He used their capital to shoot his own independent music videos. He set up his own label infrastructure within the company.
His endgame wasn't just to be a highly paid employee. It was to master the mechanics of production so he could ultimately reclaim total ownership of his enterprise.
The parallel drawn here to historical figures is profound, specifically Reuben Hurricane Carter. If we want to talk about the ultimate mechanism of dependency, it is the prison system.
Right. Carter was a highly successful middleweight boxer who was wrongfully convicted of a triple murder in 1966. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms.
And prison is an environment meticulously designed to strip away every ounce of your autonomy. They dictate the exact minute you eat, the clothes you wear, the time the lights go out.
It is the systemic obliteration of self-reliance.
But Carter understood that while the state controlled his physical geography, they only controlled his psychology if he consented to the dependency.
So he made a radical, almost unfathomable choice. He decided he would exist as a completely free man who merely happened to be surrounded by concrete walls.
He refused to wear the standard prison uniform. He refused to eat the meals provided in the mess hall, sustaining himself on canned soup he purchased from the commissary.
He even refused to attend his own parole hearings.
Wait, he refused parole hearings? That sounds like self-sabotage. If you're wrongfully convicted, wouldn't you fight at every hearing?
To the outside observer, yes. But to Carter, participating in the parole process was an implicit acknowledgement that the state had the legitimate moral authority to grant him his freedom.
Wow.
He refused to validate their authority. Instead, he reclaimed what is often called dead time. He didn't just sit in his cell wasting away, he read voraciously.
He studied philosophy, history, and the intricacies of the law so he could actively direct his own appeals process. Exactly. He maintained such absolute, terrifying ownership of his internal world that when his conviction was finally overturned 19 years later, he did not walk out as a broken, institutionalized dependent. He walked out intact.
Okay, I want to push back on this concept of extreme self-reliance for a second. If I'm listening to this and I decide I'm going to be completely self-reliant, I'm not going to depend on my team, I'm not going to ask for help, I'm going to lone wolf my entire career. Isn't that just a fast track to profound alienation?
That is a crucial nuance to untangle.
Don't we need strategic dependencies to scale anything meaningful?
The philosophy is not advocating for hermetic isolation. It is not saying you shouldn't have employees, partners, or mentors. Jackson had a massive crew. He had global distribution partners.
Right, he didn't do everything literally by himself.
The distinction lies in the difference between strategic alliance and fundamental dependency. You can collaborate with a massive corporation, but you must mentally own your own exit strategy.
Oh.
The moment your core identity or your ability to generate income becomes inextricably tied to a single boss, a single client, or a single platform, you are vulnerable. You have surrendered your leverage. You must cultivate the capacity to walk away.
I see. It's about possessing the ultimate veto power over your own life.
Exactly.
But even if you perfectly insulate yourself, even if you're entirely self-reliant, systemic disasters still happen. The market crashes. You get sick.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, the concept of opportunism, what Jackson calls turning shit into sugar.
And this is where his biography hits its absolute zenith of chaos.
Yeah.
May 2000. He is sitting in the back of a car outside his grandmother's house in Queens, and a hired assassin pulls up and shoots him 9 times at point-blank range.
9 times. One bullet shatters his jaw, another hits his legs, his hands.
He survives, which is a medical anomaly in itself. But the professional fallout is absolute devastation. Columbia Records is terrified of the violence surrounding him, so they drop him from his contract.
He is effectively blackballed from the formal music industry. No executive wants to risk their life backing an artist with an active hit on his head.
Right. He is entirely out of capital. He cannot safely return to hustling on the street. And because of the assassins, he cannot even book a club to perform live.
By every conventional metric of human achievement, this is a permanent, life-ruining checkmate.
But this is where we see the mechanics of extreme opportunism. He realizes he has hit absolute rock bottom.
And the psychological benefit of rock bottom is that the fear of falling disappears. You have nothing left to protect.
Wow, that's a powerful way to look at it.
He took the immense physical trauma, the rejection from the corporate world, and the anger, and used it as raw, combustible fuel. If the radio wouldn't play him and the clubs wouldn't book him, he would bypass the gatekeepers entirely.
He started pirating the most popular beats on the radio, recording his own aggressive, hungry lyrics over them, and flooding the underground market in New York with bootleg mixtapes.
We have to look at the physics of what he did here. He didn't just survive the obstacle, he weaponized it.
The inability to tour, the lack of a marketing budget, the threat to his life. These were massive negatives, but he inverted them.
Because his music was suddenly playing on every street corner, yet he was physically nowhere to be seen. It created an explosive mystique.
He framed himself not as a victim, but as the ultimate authentic rebel operating outside a sanitized fake corporate system.
He converted the exact forces that were designed to destroy him into the engine of his massive ascent, which ultimately forced the industry, specifically Eminem and Dr. Dre, to come to him.
What is the underlying psychological mechanism there? Like, how does someone actually apply that when they lose a major client or get laid off?
The mechanism relies on accepting that events in the universe are fundamentally neutral.
Neutral.
Yes. The universe possesses no moral opinion on whether you get shot, fired, or promoted. It is purely our fearful, narrative-driven minds that label an event as a catastrophe or a setback.
That's tough to swallow when you're in the middle of it.
It is, but when you label an event as a setback, your physiological response is to retreat, conserve energy, and wait for the storm to pass. True opportunists operate more like Aikido masters.
Oh, I like that analogy.
They see an obstacle merely as kinetic energy. The attacker's momentum is a resource. You don't try to stop the fist, you grab the wrist and redirect the momentum to throw them.
So when you get laid off, the opportunist doesn't wait for a better job market. They use the sudden injection of free time and the sting of rejection to launch the venture they were previously too comfortable to start.
Exactly. It's a phenomenal reframe.
But once you master that Aikido,
Right.
once you start converting obstacles into forward momentum, you accelerate. You are suddenly thrust into a chaotic, high-velocity environment.
And how you navigate that speed determines whether you build an empire or crash a Ferrari.
Which brings us to chapters 4 and 5, the concepts of flow and force. Let's break down flow first, or what the authors call calculated momentum.
They take us back to the late 1980s, during the peak of the crack epidemic. The introduction of crack completely detonated the traditional, structured, mafia-style hierarchies of the drug trade.
The market became hyper-volatile, decentralized, and incredibly fast-paced.
And Jackson is watching an older, highly established drug lord named Jermaine try to survive in this new economy. Jermaine is driving a red Ferrari, he has a massive crew, and he is trying to control his territory using a top-down, dictatorial, highly centralized model.
He wants to sell one specific product exactly his way and violently crush any competition.
And Jermaine is swiftly murdered. His organizational structure was simply too rigid, too heavy, and too slow to adapt to a rapidly mutating, agile market.
Jackson observed this and immediately internalized the lesson. Instead of building a heavy, centralized target, he adopted extreme operational fluidity.
He wouldn't just run one massive operation, he ran 4 or 5 smaller, distinct hustles simultaneously.
If the police raided one block, it didn't bankrupt him. He had 3 other nodes generating capital.
He didn't micromanage his team either. He decentralized the decision-making, giving his workers autonomy as long as they hit their numbers.
It's basically the exact model modern tech startups use to disrupt legacy corporations. Agile methodology versus the waterfall method.
Right, and again, he scales this up. When he attains global fame, he refuses to let his identity solidify as just a rapper. Because if the music industry shifts or public tastes change, a rigid identity gets you killed economically.
So he diversifies. He partners with a relatively unknown beverage company to launch vitamin water, eventually securing a massive equity payout when Coca-Cola buys it.
He produces television shows, he writes books, he launches clothing lines. He ensures his economic footprint is so distributed that a failure in one sector is easily absorbed by the others.
But here's where the philosophy introduces a vital counterweight. Fluidity is essential. But if you are only fluid, if you always adapt and always flow around obstacles, you eventually become a pushover.
People will recognize that you avoid conflict and they will exploit you. This is why you must master force, or knowing when to be bad.
Enter the infamous Ja Rule and Supreme conflict. This is a masterclass in calculated aggression. Jackson is trying to break into the mainstream, and Ja Rule is currently one of the biggest, most lucrative stars on the planet.
Ja Rule's entire brand is built on being a hardcore street guy from Queens, and he is financially backed by a man named Supreme, who was an actual, highly feared, former drug kingpin.
So one night, Jackson is at a club. A friend of his,
Hmm.
a guy who had literally just robbed Ja Rule of his signature jewelry a few weeks prior, standing right there.
Ja Rule sees the guy who robbed him and actively looks away. He pretends it didn't happen to avoid a confrontation.
To a civilian, that's just conflict avoidance.
But to someone with the hustler's eye, it is a massive structural vulnerability. Jackson instantly deduced that Ja Rule's entire public persona was a fabrication. He was a studio gangsta.
He possessed fame and money, but he lacked the actual biological wiring for confrontation.
Seeing this weakness, Jackson didn't flow around it. He attacked it with overwhelming force. He unleashed a barrage of highly aggressive, surgically targeted diss tracks.
He didn't just mock Ja Rule's music, he publicly detailed Supreme's past criminal operations. He intentionally manufactured a massive, highly dangerous feud with a legitimate crime syndicate.
Which, on paper, sounds completely irrational. Why would you intentionally poke a bear that has the capacity to kill you?
Because it was a mechanism to instantly hijack their social capital. By taking an unshakable, hyper-aggressive stance against the biggest artist in the world, Jackson forced the public to pay attention to him.
In primate hierarchies, if a lower-ranking male challenges the alpha and doesn't back down, the rest of the tribe immediately reassesses the hierarchy.
Jackson proved his own terrifying authenticity while exposing Ja Rule's fragility. The public watched Ja Rule hesitate, and his empire rapidly crumbled.
The text pairs this with a harrowing story from the life of author Richard Wright.
Wright's story is visceral. He grew up in unimaginable poverty in the Jim Crow South, enduring systemic racist abuse and constant physical beatings from his own family members.
One afternoon, his uncle threatens to brutally beat him over a completely trivial misunderstanding. Wright, though just a teenager and physically outmatched, reaches his absolute limit.
He grabs two razor blades, stands directly in front of his uncle, and calmly states that if his uncle touches him, he is prepared to fight until one of them is dead.
And his uncle freezes. He backs down and never lays a hand on Wright again. What Wright discovered in that moment is a fundamental law of human behavioral psychology.
Submitting to unprovoked aggression only signals to the predator that you are an easy calorie.
If you back down to keep the peace, the aggressor will continue to push the boundary until they consume you entirely. But if you take a genuine fighting stance, if you signal a willingness to endure mutual destruction, you radically alter the risk calculus for the aggressor. You force respect.
Greene ties this perfectly to Machiavelli's concept of the fox and the lion. Because the real enemy here isn't the competitor, it's our own neurological hardwiring.
Exactly. Machiavelli observed that humans suffer from a fixed nature. We are deeply conditioned by our past successes.
So if your natural disposition is to be highly cautious and analytical like a fox, you will try to negotiate and analyze your way out of every problem.
Even when a situation clearly demands a lion-like roar of aggression. And if your natural disposition is aggression, you will try to intimidate people even when a delicate, fox-like diplomatic touch is required.
True fearlessness requires neuroplasticity. You must possess the capacity to fluidly switch your nature based strictly on what the immediate reality demands.
Jackson was a fox when building his decentralized business portfolio, but a lion the moment Ja Rule showed weakness.
But let me ask you this. If I'm listening to this and I'm trying to flow between 5 different side hustles and then jumping into aggressive negotiations with competitors, how do I ensure I'm actually making forward progress?
Right, how do you not just spin your wheels?
Exactly. How do you avoid the trap of reacting to every stimulus and mistaking mere movement for actual momentum?
That is where the calculated part of calculated momentum becomes paramount. It is not about frantic, panicked movement. The psychological state they describe is mental flow. Mental flow.
Mental flow requires an almost unnatural emotional equilibrium. If one of your business experiments fails, you do not spend 3 weeks nursing your bruised ego. You cleanly detach and allocate your resources to the next node.
If someone insults you, you do not harbor a toxic, distracting grudge unless destroying them serves a specific mathematical strategic purpose.
You approach your life like a venture capitalist. You run multiple diversified experiments like Jackson's various hustles, fully accepting that several will fail.
But knowing that the one massive success will exponentially cover the losses. The daily tactics are entirely fluid, but the overarching strategic objective remains unyielding.
That clarifies it perfectly.
So you master self-reliance, you use momentum, you apply calculated force, and eventually you acquire territory. You gain power, you gain a title, you build a team.
But as history shows us time and time again, conquering a throne requires an entirely different skill set than keeping it.
Which brings us to chapters 6 and 7. How a fearless individual manages the people below them. authority and connection. We'll look at authority first, which they define as leading from the front. This completely dismantles the conventional Western corporate model of leadership.
Where a CEO sits insulated in a corner office reading quarterly reports and issuing email memos to a staff they rarely interact with.
To illustrate real authority, they recount an incident from Jackson's street days. There was an older, highly volatile hustler named Wayne who decided he wanted Jackson's territory.
Wayne explicitly threatened to have Jackson murdered. Now, standard street protocol, the fixed, predictable nature, would dictate that Jackson gather his crew, arm themselves, and launch a direct, bloody assault on Wayne.
Which realistically ends with everyone either dead or serving life sentences.
But Jackson bypasses the predictable script. He engages in pure asymmetric warfare. He doesn't go after Wayne at all.
Instead, he bypasses Wayne and directly attacks Wayne's supplier. He physically robs the men, providing Wayne with his product, completely severing Wayne's supply chain.
This lateral maneuver terrified the entire neighborhood because it was so radically unorthodox. It signaled a level of strategic fearlessness that violence alone couldn't convey.
It instantly established Jackson not just as a survivor, but as a hustler king. He cemented his authority not by screaming threats on a street corner, but through decisive, unpredictable action.
And he translated this exact mechanism of authority into the corporate boardroom. Years later, he's preparing to release his third studio album, Curtis.
He observes that the executives at Interscope Records have grown complacent. They view him as a safe, established legacy brand, so they aren't allocating the necessary aggressive marketing budget.
He realizes that if he sends a polite email asking for more support, they will ignore him. So he manufactures a crisis.
He deliberately leaks his own highly anticipated music video to the internet, bypassing their exclusive release strategy. And he publicly threatens to completely halt all promotional activities for the album.
It was a shock to the system. It terrified the executives because it proved he was not reliant on their machinery. It snapped them out of their complacency.
But more importantly, it sent a visceral message to his own internal team. It showed them that he was still entirely in command, and that he was perfectly willing to bring the entire house to the ground if the work wasn't executed to his exact standards.
We often think of authority as the guy with the megaphone shouting instructions from the watchtower. But true authority is more like a tuning fork.
A tuning fork, I love that.
Yeah. When you strike a tuning fork, it vibrates at a highly specific, intense frequency. And any object nearby that shares that resonant frequency naturally begins to vibrate alongside it.
Your team, your employees, they do not obey your corporate mission statement. They entrain to your actual operational frequency.
If you're cautious, lethargic, and fearful, your organization will go dead. If you are taking calculated risks, working relentlessly, and leading from the front, the organization naturally resonates with that intensity.
That is exactly how the physics of leadership operate. But there's a massive vulnerability that comes with that authority, which leads directly to the concept of protection.
Right, because when you lead from the front and you acquire massive success, you inevitably become isolated.
You are suddenly surrounded by a layer of management publicists, handlers, yes men, whose entire job is to filter reality for you. They tell you what you want to hear to protect their own paychecks.
This isolation is lethal because it cuts you off from the intense realism we discussed at the very beginning. The rule is you must know your environment from the inside out.
When Jackson was on the street, his data gathering was frictionless. He didn't just count the daily profits. He stood on the corner and talked directly to the addicts.
He knew exactly what the market demanded, he saw when their preferences shifted, and he watched what the rival crews were doing in real time.
But as a multi-millionaire global superstar, he couldn't exactly stand on a corner in Queens anymore. He was trapped in the ivory tower.
So he engineered a way to collapse that distance digitally, years before it became a standard industry practice.
He invested heavily in building a massive, dedicated social networking platform for his fans. Instead of relying on focus groups or radio programmers to tell him what the public wanted, he would release rough testers, unpolished trial tracks directly to his audience.
He would personally read the comments, interact with the fans, and even live stream his daily life from his phone. He completely eviscerated the corporate middlemen and plugged his nervous system directly back into the zeitgeist.
The historical parallel here is profound. Malcolm X. As Malcolm X's influence scaled globally, as he started appearing on national television and speaking at elite universities, he noticed a subtle, dangerous shift in his own psychology.
He felt a creeping paternalism. He felt a growing chasm between his daily reality as a famous figure and the visceral daily suffering of the black ghettos he was advocating for.
Malcolm X understood the mechanics of power decay. He knew that if his anger became theoretical, if he became an out-of-touch intellectual, his words would lose their resonant frequency.
The people would sense the distance.
To prevent this, he instituted a rigorous practice. He intentionally sought out and spent time with the absolute lowest rungs of society's street hustlers, addicts, people who had suffered recent horrific injustices at the hands of the police.
He didn't do this for a photo op. He did it to actively reinfect himself with their raw, unfiltered rage.
He forced himself to absorb their reality so that the intensity fueling his movement never decayed into comfortable bourgeois activism.
So the core insight for anyone leading a team today is about the psychology of respect. In the real world, whether you are running a street operation or a Fortune 500 division, your title means absolutely nothing.
Your past quarterly earnings mean nothing. Respect is a perishable commodity. It must be actively earned and re-earned every single day through daily friction.
If you demand compliance simply because your email signature says director, you will instantly breed silent resentment.
You have to embody the mission so entirely and stay so intimately connected to the ground-level truth of your employees' daily struggles that the group naturally polices itself to align with your vision.
But we have to be honest here. Sustaining this level of intense realism, constantly flowing, constantly asserting authority, and battling isolation, it is cognitively and physically exhausting.
The friction is immense. To avoid burning out and collapsing under the weight of this philosophy, you must cultivate incredibly deep, unshakable internal structures.
Which brings us to the final and arguably most profound section of this deep dive, the ultimate internal battles. Chapters 8, 9, and 10, which cover mastery, self-belief, and the confrontation with mortality.
Let's start with mastery, or what they call respecting the process. This is a deeply uncomfortable concept for the modern mind.
We are living in an era entirely optimized to eliminate friction. We're terrified of boredom. We want the hack, the 30-day course, the overnight virality.
But the architecture of true power requires enduring the drudgery. Let's look at the biology of mastery. When you learn a new skill, your brain has to force electrical signals down new, inefficient neural pathways.
It feels clunky, it feels frustrating, and it is deeply boring.
But as a teenager, Jackson saw the older guys making fast, violent money, and he recognized it was a trap. Fast money requires zero mastery, which means you are easily replaceable.
So he spent grueling, unglamorous hours in the boxing gym. Boxing didn't pay him, but it taught his nervous system discipline.
Later, when he pivoted to music, he didn't just try to record a quick, catchy hook. He spent years practically living in the studio, apprenticing under the legendary producer Jam Master Jay.
He learned the tedious, microscopic details of song structure, bar counts, and audio engineering. The historical examples of this physiological conditioning are incredible. Look at Jack Johnson, the first African-American world heavyweight boxing champion.
Early in his career, he would intentionally endure brutal, sustained physical beatings in the ring. He wasn't trying to win those early fights. He was using the live combat strictly as a laboratory to master evasive footwork and physiological pacing.
Or look at Demosthenes in ancient Greece.
Demosthenes is the ultimate case study in neurological rewiring. He desperately wanted to be a prominent lawyer and statesman, but he was afflicted with a severe stutter and a painfully weak voice.
If he accepted his fixed nature, he would have quit.
Instead, he built an underground study chamber. He literally shaved half of his hair off so that he would be too physically embarrassed to leave the house, forcing himself into isolation.
He then practiced reciting complex arguments with his mouth stuffed full of pebbles while sprinting up steep hills to build his lung capacity.
That is an insane level of commitment.
It is, but it illustrates the mechanism. He endured the agonizing dead time of repetitive practice until his brain mapped entirely new neural pathways.
He pushed through the conscious, frustrating stage of learning until public speaking became an intuitive, unconscious reflex. That is what mastery actually is.
You persist through the boredom until the skill wraps itself in myelin sheathing and becomes permanently embedded in your nervous system.
And once you have built that undeniable mastery, you need the sheer audacity to deploy it, which is the essence of Chapter 9. Push beyond your limits or self-belief.
We return to Jackson, fresh out of the hospital after being shot 9 times. He is physically shattered. He has zero financial backing. He's a target.
He calls a meeting in the cramped living room of his grandparents' house with his most loyal street-level fans. They call this the meeting of the wolves.
He sits these guys down, and despite his complete lack of resources, he projects a massive, reality-distorting vision.
He tells them with absolute clinical certainty that he is going to build a global entertainment and business empire. He tells them that if they act as his vanguard, if they provide his security and push his mixtapes, he will personally fund their college educations.
And make them executives in his future corporations.
And because his internal conviction was so radically disconnected from his external ruin, it became infectious. They bought into his reality distortion field entirely.
And over the next decade, he fulfilled every single promise he made in that living room. The mechanism of self-belief is fascinating because it's about where you locate your locus of control.
The text brings up Frederick Douglass again to highlight this. Douglass was enslaved and sent to a man named Mr. Covey. Covey was not just a farmer. His explicit professional function was to be a slave breaker.
He used relentless physical torture and psychological warfare to systematically crush the spirit of rebellious slaves.
And Covey almost succeeded. Douglass reached the absolute brink of psychological collapse, but he experienced a profound internal pivot.
He realized that while Covey possessed total control over his physical body, Covey could only break his spirit if Douglass granted him the authority to define his worth.
So Douglass actively constructed an internal identity of such immense, untouchable value that no amount of physical trauma could degrade it. He shifted his locus of control entirely inward.
Your self-worth must be an internally generated currency. If you require external validation, if you wait for your boss, your industry, or society to tell you that you are valuable, you will conform to the exact limited boundaries they set for you.
You have to act like a king to be treated like one.
But the ultimate boundary, the one barrier that every single human being is fundamentally terrified to look at, is the focus of the final law. Confront your mortality, the sublime.
We circle back one last time to Jackson on the operating table. He is bleeding out. He describes experiencing the classic phenomenon.
A searing, intensely bright light and a dark shadow rapidly creeping across it.
In that exact fraction of a second, he realized with absolute certainty that he was going to die. And in that realization, the panic vanished. He felt a profound, odd calmness.
Now, he survived the surgery, but he retained that psychological calmness. He reasoned that if he stared into the absolute void of death and was no longer afraid of it, he had absolutely nothing left to fear in the realm of the living.
Right. It granted him a terrifying level of emotional detachment. When he was negotiating massive, high-stakes corporate contracts later in life, if the executives tried to pressure him or the deal wasn't right, he could simply stand up and walk out of the room.
He felt no anxiety because his baseline comparison was 9 bullets and a hospital table. A bad contract is mathematically meaningless compared to death.
The philosophical foundation for this is deeply rooted in Stoicism, particularly the writings of Seneca. Seneca was one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in Rome, but he fell out of favor and was banished to the brutal, desolate island of Corsica.
To survive the immense psychological anguish of losing everything, he engaged in the practice of memento mori.
He actively, daily, imagined his own death in the most painful, visceral ways possible. He wasn't being morbid. He was systematically stripping death of its power over his mind.
Okay, I have to jump in here. Because if I tell a friend, hey, to achieve your ultimate power at work, you should spend 20 minutes a day vividly imagining your own funeral, they're going to think I need therapy.
Yeah, people generally don't love hearing that.
For the average person, doesn't dwelling on mortality cause profound depression? Doesn't it paralyze you with the futility of it all?
It seems highly counterintuitive, but the psychological reality is the exact opposite. What actually causes chronic low-level anxiety and depression is our desperate, constant denial of death.
We expend massive amounts of subconscious energy pretending we have unlimited time.
We numb ourselves with endless scrolling, trivial arguments, and safe routines because acknowledging our finite timeline is uncomfortable. But when you forcefully confront it, when you accept that your days are strictly mathematically numbered, it recalibrates your brain's entire risk assessment algorithm.
It destroys the fear of social rejection.
Exactly. Why would you spend a week agonizing over whether to speak up in a meeting or whether to launch your business when you deeply understand that in a few decades, you and everyone in that meeting will be dust?
It creates what Greene calls the sublime.
It is an awe-inspiring, crystalline awareness that makes every single minute infinitely more valuable. It replaces ambient anxiety with a fierce, joyful urgency. You realize you quite literally do not have the time to be afraid. You only have time for action.
So to synthesize this entire framework, Mastery provides the neurological hardware and the actual skills you need to operate. Self-belief gives you the audacious software to run those skills on a massive scale.
And confronting your own mortality is the ultimate firewall bypass. It completely strips away the social conditioning and the evolutionary fear that keeps us timid.
It is a holistic, interwoven system. True power isn't about accumulating money or dominating other people. It's an inside job that begins with how we contextualize our own end.
That is the ultimate realization of the 50th law. It is a manual for recognizing and escaping the invisible prison we discussed in the first minute.
By actively rejecting media-fed panic, practicing intense realism, utilizing the kinetic energy of obstacles, remaining fluid yet capable of force, leading fearlessly, and keeping the reality of death firmly in your peripheral vision, you break the confines of that panopticon.
And if there's one caveat to leave you with, it is this. This fearless attitude is not a genetic trait. Curtis Jackson was not born with a bulletproof mind.
Abraham Lincoln was not genetically predisposed to pure pragmatism. Fearlessness is a muscle. And like any muscle, if you retreat into comfort, it rapidly atrophies. The anxiety will creep back in.
You have to actively, intentionally place yourself in environments of friction and discomfort to keep it strong. It requires daily reps.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought. Think about the one specific decision in your life right now that you are most terrified to make. The difficult conversation you are avoiding. The career pivot you keep finding logical excuses to delay. The creative risk you won't publish.
What if the physiological terror you feel isn't a warning sign to back away?
What if it's not a hypersensitive car alarm? What if that exact fear is actually a highly calibrated compass, pointing you directly toward the specific door you must walk through to claim your ultimate autonomy?
What would the fearless version of you do tomorrow?
That is the defining question. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration helps you spot the invisible walls in your own life and provides you the mechanics to break through them. Good luck in forging your own fearless empire.